So how did you get to know the language that you know? And see, at the heart of this debate is a version of the very familiar nature versus nurture question. Is language something that we learn entirely from scratch by being exposed to it and essentially by figuring it out? Or do we come into this world with some degree of knowledge or preparation in our neural system to learn language? So some predisposition that predisposes us, and this is the case for us, but apparently not other species, that predisposes us to learn language. Now, we covered this at the beginning of this class, and behaviorism, and Skinner in particular, really thought that language was learned on the basis of exactly the same kind of mechanisms that allow us to learn anything else. And so the idea is that simply through trial and error and reinforcement for correct versus incorrect language, and by modeling of what other people's linguistic behavior, children would slowly figure out the kind of things they can say, the kind of things they can't say, and this is how they learned language. Of course, there's something that seems to limit this point of view. For one, if truly what you have learned is a behavior, really a list of sentences that you can and cannot say, how is it that you can understand and even produce sentences that you've never heard before in your own language? So that already is a clear point of friction. And as we discussed at the beginning of this class, Chomsky pointed out that these kind of mechanisms were not enough to generate the language that we see children learn. Now, at the heart of this criticism is an intuition that there has to be an innate aspect to language, because the rules of grammar are often very ambiguous, and we nonetheless seem to learn them on the basis of overall a very limited number of examples. This is also known as Plato's problem. How is it that children with extremely different environments seem to all arrive at a fairly accurate and generally fairly similar representation of grammar of a certain language in their mind? How is it that my English is the same overall as your English, at least in terms of its structure, of our understanding of the rules of the grammar, and that your English is the same as, you know, all of these the other students in this class, each of whom has lived a very different experience up to today and has been exposed in their youth to a very different type of English just because of the different context, and I will cover this in just a moment. How is it that despite this, we all converged overall on a fairly similar understanding of how English works in terms of its grammar? And the viewpoint from Chomsky is that the only answer to this puzzle is that there has to be something inside our mind that predisposes us to understand the rules of how a language works. And we come into this world with this predisposition. As I'll argue a little more in a moment, no differently than the way in which you come into this world prepared for processing auditory information. And see, one key observation to lead to this point of view is the fact that there's a remarkably uniform development and acquisition of language in development. And again, Chomsky saw this as clear indication that there has to be something more than just us figuring it out according to, you know, the input we get from parents and teachers and things like that. If you think that there's just so much variability in the amount of language that children hear, and again, each one of us has grown in a different circumstance, in a different setting. So we all got exposed to very different amount of linguistic input. And yet, most children grow to learn language and to master language in a specific number of milestones that are fairly uniform and fairly rapidly so. Again, Chomsky thought it has to mean that there has to be something in our minds that predisposes us to learn language. And you see here a number the typical milestones of language development. Between 8 months and a year, children very typically start using single words. Then between 1 and 2 years, you get 2 words, phrases, et cetera, et cetera. And these milestones are fairly systematic. So let's talk about this variability. Look, first, simple observation. Children who grow in different families might just be exposed to different environments. They're certainly exposed to different quantity of languages, the degree to which parents speak to their children or don't speak to the children. In fact, this is also a cultural difference across different cultures. Even the quality of language, needless to say, children that grow up in families that have a high degree of scholarizations tend to be exposed to a different type of language than family in contexts where there hasn't been a lot of scolarization, obviously. Similarly, children seem to acquire language, again, uniformly and with a similar timing, despite very different cognitive abilities. I mean, intellect is just, is distributed more or less across different people. And you might know very smart people and slightly less smart people. But we all seem to develop the same language in the same way with the same timing. Again, in terms of its grammatical structure, not in terms of the vocabulary. And I'll get back to this in a little bit. In fact, even once you start getting to the extremes of the distribution, children still seem to develop language fairly uniformly, even in the face of some types of pathology. Blind children, for example, acquire color and sight-related words, just like sighted children. One particularly striking example is children with Williams syndrome. Now, these children are socially and emotionally very intelligent, very talented for musically, typically. They have a very advanced and even unusual vocabulary, and at times even syntax. Generally very happy, they love to laugh, they love to make people laugh. But they do have very severe cognitive limitations, including very poor focus, so inability, definitely an attention impairment, certainly visuospatial difficulties. And overall, if you test them on an IQ test, they tend to be between the 50s and 60s in terms of score, whatever IQs measure. But clearly, they're different than your neurotypical child. And yet, as I said, they develop excellent language. In fact, sometimes the vocabulary tends to be more erudite than your standard child. And even in their use of syntax and constructs, they tend to have a very advanced constructs and to use very advanced and complex structures. So despite having a set of differences with neurotypical children, they clearly acquire language just as well. In fact, even a little bit better in terms of their ability to understand and to produce language. Now, language learning in general is also largely unguided, meaning parents don't really give feedback the way behaviorists imply. And the feedback that parents give is usually not based on whether something is grammatical or not, but it's based on the truth value. So if a child says something that is true but uses wrong syntax, parents tend to reward that. If they see something that is false but with good syntax, parents tend to correct that. So the examples of language that we're exposed to and the way in which we're rewarded or sort of acknowledged in our development of language does not seem to be enough to explain how it is that we all get to acquire the same language. Another striking example is that of Pigeon Languages and Creole languages. So the idea is that when speakers from different languages and different cultures come into contact, they often create a type of a sort of a makeshift compromise language that tends to arise very rapidly. Often this happens in the context of trade. If you think back to sort of colonial times, when people from very different cultures that didn't have a language in common would have to meet and would have to trade and bargain and sort of and live in proximity. Typically, people involved in these kind of activities would quickly develop a makeshift language, which is a very incomplete type language. Um, it's just a language that permits, functional communication. It permits to get the job done, whatever the job was, typically something like trade. It doesn't need to be a complete language, and it typically results from a mix of, the vocabulary basics and the syntax basics from sort of both languages in some complex mix. Just enough, as I said, that people could functionally communicate. Now, what is interesting is that these languages then tend to exhibit, particularly in children who are born in this pigeon language environment, these languages tend to exhibit a tension towards becoming, towards the systematization, which means elimination of irregularities and things of that sort. And so this systematization then results in the birth of what we call Creole languages, which is a pigeon language that has turned into a language characterized by a consistent system of grammar, characterized by a stable, typically much larger vocabulary that permits talking about anything. And most importantly, Creole languages are languages that can be acquired by children at birth as mother tongue languages. Pigeon languages are not languages that children learn. Children spontaneously creolize pigeon languages. It's almost as if children born in pigeon languages realized that there was something missing from their language and kind of regularized it and completed it. And again, how would you possibly, if you believed in behaviorism, how could a child possibly complete and systematize a language? The child doesn't know anything about what a language is other than what they hear. So it has to be that there's something inside our mind that spontaneously tells us this is not what a language looks like. A language has all these other things. And so children born in these environments spontaneously tend to creolize these languages by completing them and systematizing them. And of course, the only way of understanding this is if there's something in our mind that predisposes us towards languages having certain features. Finally, a last example of this is so-called deaf isolates. Now, sometimes deaf children are born to hearing parents, and it takes time to realize that a child is deaf. It's not always as easy. There are tests for this now, but it was not always that easy to realize that a child was deaf. Now, what is interesting is that these children often tend to develop a rudimentary sign language of their own. And this is what is so puzzling. How is it that you can spend 21 months focused exclusively on teaching a chimpanzee human language, and that's all you do, and there you have a group of scientists and teachers whose sole job is to train a chimpanzee in acquiring human language, and they never get anywhere. A human child, on the other hand, can pretty much hear no language at all, and with minimal input, and they will spontaneously create some sort of proto-language. It must mean something about what is in our nature and what is in our neural endowment. And this is the case that Chomsky has been trying to make. And he typically refers to this as universal grammar. It's an innate capacity to learn language given, a small, what he calls a modicum, a tiny bit of input. And this is it's part of your genes, it's part of your DNA, it's part of your brain. And because it's part of your DNA and part of your brain, it also constrains it constrains how language can be and how it cannot be. In the sense, and I'll explain this in just a second, in a sense, language is really no different than any other neurocognitive system in your brain. Look, take your visual system. You are born to see color. You didn't figure out color. You came into this world with your DNA encoding and implementing in your brain that you can see color. And you already had this all set up before you ever saw any color. It was already there for you. And On top of that, the machinery inside your brain determines what you can and what you can't see. For example, you can see what we call the visible part of the spectrum, of the electromagnetic spectrum. Everything else, you can't see it. So in this sense, your DNA specifies which part of the electromagnetic spectrum you can and you can't see. Well, language is the same thing. You come into this world with a certain mechanism, and that specifies the kind of language you can do and the kind of language you can't do. Right? So in this sense, Chomsky is saying language is really no different than any other part of our brain. You come into this world with prepared for a certain thing, and that's what you develop. And of course, that constrains what you can develop. So in this sense, Chomsky is really saying language is no different than any other part of your brain. Now, of course, and this is a frequent misunderstanding, when Chomsky said that it's a universal grammar, he meant what's inside here. He meant I language, not that Italian, French, Hindi, etc. have the same grammar. And see, the obvious problem with that would be that a child can learn any natural language. You can take a child from anywhere in the world, relocate them upon birth to anywhere else in the world, and they will learn the local language as native speakers. So it cannot be that in your mind you have, the grammar of Italian or the grammar of Chinese or the grammar of Spanish. It can't be that. You must have in your mind something that is general to all languages. Okay, so this was sort of is one way of understanding this hypothesis. And so, and in fact, this particular way of understanding this innateness hypothesis is often referred to as principles and parameters. Let me explain. The idea is that you don't come into this world with, as I said, Greek and French inside your mind. You come into this world with a set of principles and a set of parameters, which as soon as you hear a little bit of language, the principles and parameters together allow you to develop a fully fledged language. Let me give you a couple examples just to make it a little more pragmatic. So first, by principle, what we typically mean is a finite set of fundamental principles that are common to all languages. And some of these, I have to admit, are pretty involved. So I just want to give you one as an example so you understand the kind of thing we're talking about. And one such principle is referred to as the trace eraser principle. The idea that if you move something in a sentence, when you move something away from its initial position, it leaves a little trace that it started out, in a certain place in a sentence. For example, one way of seeing this is by using contractions. Take this sentence, I want to sing. As you probably know, if want and to are nearby each other, you can contract them into wanna. So if I say I want to sing a song, I could perfectly well say I wanna sing a song, and that'd be perfectly acceptable because want and to together form, you can contract them into wanna. But if I were to say I want Axel to sing a song, I can't contract it. And I can't contract what and to because Axel is in between them. And so I can't contract them, okay? So now let's make a little trick. Let's turn I want Axel to sing a song into a question because that allows us to move Axel away from that. So I want Axel to sing a song. We take Axel, we create a question in the same way that you usually do in English. We take Axel, we move it away and we put it at the beginning of the sentence. Okay, and so we've moved away Axel in order to create the sentence. So now the question would be, who do I want to sing a song? And of course, now want and the to are nearby each other, right? Because Axel is gone. Can I contract them? Can I say, what do I wanna sing a song? Turns out you can't, right? It doesn't sound right. Why? Because Axel left a trace of itself in between want and to. It got moved away to ask the question, but it left a trace in the place where it started. And the trace, it's a bit like a ghost. It left a little ghost. The only way you can see the ghost, you can't see it directly because Axel is gone, but you can see a ghost because want and the to, despite being nearby each other, can't get contracted. The only reason for want and to being unable to contract is if something is in between them. So it's got to be that in between want and the to, there's a ghost, which is the trace of Axel. This is what we mean by the trace eraser principle. When something moves, it leaves a little mark of where it started from. This seems to be, at least the claim is, this seems to be a universal principle. All languages seem to have this principle under this view. So that's a principle. A parameter is a slightly different thing. A parameter is a finite set of binary parameters that determine, how a language works. What kind of things can one language do and what kind of things a language cannot do. Again, let me give you just two examples which will make it probably easier to understand. One such parameter is the null subject parameter, which simply asks, do finite verbs need to have a subject? Or can I do away with putting a subject in my sentence? So in English, for example, you can say, Angel speaks French, but you can't say speaks French. You need to say Angel. You need the subject in there. So in English, you do not allow for null subject. You can't not have the subject overtly said in an English sentence. Now, there's one tiny exception to that, which I'm sure you're thinking about, but in that case, which is if you give a command, but in that case, the subject is obvious. Whereas other languages allow you to be vague about the subject. In Italian, for example, you can say Angela parla francese, which is Angel speaks French, but you can also say parla francese. You can omit the subject, which would be exactly like saying speaks French, and it's perfectly fine. The context kind of vaguely implies who it could be, although it could be vague. So it's not like an imperative. It's not like issuing a command where the subject is obvious. In this case, in Italian, you can get rid of the subject, and that's just fine. So in Italian, the null subject parameter is on. In English, it's off. Other examples, very typical. In English, you can say she will come, but you can't say will come. That's incorrect. In Italian, you can, because this parameter is on. In Italian, I can say lei verrà, which means she will come, lei being she. But I can also say verrà, will come. Totally fine. Totally acceptable. French, you can say elle viendra, she will come. You can't say viendra. Okay. So the idea is that this parameter is off in English, on Italian, off in French. So this is what we mean by parameters, settings that a language might or might not have. And the theory, the hypothesis is that there's a restricted variation. It could be that sometimes you can do it and sometimes you can't, but that's not the case. Languages, either you can or you can't. There's no middle ground. It's a binary setting. That's what's so important. And so now if you're a child, all you need to figure out is, can I do it or not? If I hear mommy and daddy do it at least once, good. Then it means I can do it in my language, and that's all I need to know. And from now on, in any sentence I hear or speak, I know I can get rid of the subject, and it's fine. Right? That's the idea behind this approach. Just to give you one other example, there's the question movement parameter. And the question here is, must interrogative phrases move to the front of the clause? So for example, in English, you would say, what do you think he will say? You're going to put the what at the beginning of the sentence. Now, Chinese, in fact, quite the opposite. I apologize to real speakers of Mandarin Chinese. I think this says, ni xiang xi da hui shuo shenme, and the shenme at the end, which I've underlined down here, is the what. So in Chinese, in fact, in most sentences, you tend to put the interrogative at the very end. So this would translate to, you think he will say what? Now, you as an English speaker understand what we mean, but it's non-grammatical in Italian. In Chinese, that's the way you do it. In fact, my recollection of Chinese is that most interrogatives tended to be placed at the end. If you say, ni chu nar, you go where? The nar, the where, is at the very end. And again, there could be many possibilities. There could be that, sometimes you do it and sometimes you can't, or maybe the who you have to put it at the beginning. But if a question is about a what, you don't have to put it at the beginning. It could be that there are all these middle, but that doesn't seem to be the case. or at least the theory says that that's not the case. You either have to put it at the beginning or you can put it anywhere else, but it can't be both. It has to be one or the other. And see, if you think of it this way, learning a language is so much easier on the child, because really you only need to do two things to learn a language. On the one hand, structural learning, so learning the grammar of a language, all you need to do, so you come into this world and you know you have the principles, you just come with those. Again, no different than you come into this world with rods and cones that see certain colors and don't see other. Okay? So you come into this world with principles embedded in your DNA and in your brain, and those you just have. Okay, and those are true, should be true of any language. And then there's a set of binary parameters. As a child, all you have to do is figure out each of these parameters. In my language, is it on or is it off? That's it. So English, maybe English is like this. You know, parameter 1 is on, parameter 2 and 3 are off, parameter 4 and 5 are on, et cetera, et cetera. And so as a child, all you need to do is, that's why Chomsky says all you need is a modicum of language. You need a little bit of input, just enough that you can set these parameters the right way. And so, you know, again, you hear your parents or you hear somebody who speaks your language and they do prompt, you know, the question with the interrogative, then you know that that's the right setting. Or you hear them that they do drop the subject, then you know that that's the right setting. And that's it. You don't have to hear all the sentences that somebody can produce. You don't have to be rewarded for having said or understood the right sentence. You just need to set the right parameters. And so these might be the parameters for English, but of course, children can learn any language. So maybe, you know, who knows, Amharic, which is Ethiopian, maybe these are the parameter settings for Amharic. So a child born in Ethiopia, they would set and they would hear others speak you know, a modicum of language, and they would figure out that, oh, I need to put this one on, this one on, this one off, this one off, and that's it. And from there on, you know, you can produce, you can understand and produce, and you can produce correct sentences. And you know, and again, Navajo maybe has yet another setting. So the contention, that the theory behind this is that you come into this world prepared to learn language because you have these principles and these parameters inside your mind. All you have to do is two things. First, to learn the grammar of your language, you set the parameters. You hear other people talk the language and you set the parameters. Second, you have to learn the lexicon of a language, meaning you have to learn the arbitrary association between certain meanings and certain sounds. Now, for this, you're on your own, meaning that there's no facilitatory mechanism to do this. And if you think of it, it makes complete sense, because on the one hand, the claim is you come into this world ready to acquire the grammar of a language. And indeed, our ability to acquire the grammar of a language seems to be insensitive to our personal history, to the environment within which we acquire this language. On the other hand, lexical learning seems to be very sensitive to the environment within which we learn a language. So children that come from highly scholarized environments tend to have larger vocabularies than children that come from not highly scholarized environments. And so in this sense, there's this nice contraposition between the kind of things that you come into this world ready to acquire and the kind of things that you do not.